The wilderness photographer Sarah Whitehorse lowered her camera mid-shot, her breath catching as the massive grizzly bear below didn't flee when her boot snapped a branch. This wasn't normal predator behavior. The 600-pound giant was cradling something beneath his enormous frame, his dark eyes filled with what could only be described as desperate love. Jake Running Bear grabbed Sarah's arm, his military training screaming danger, but his voice came out as a whisper. "Jesus Christ, Sarah, look at his face." The bear's scarred muzzle bore a strange marking, a deliberate D carved deep into the fur above his left eye, and beneath his protective stance, two tiny cubs whimpered with the weak cries of the starving. "Call Dr. Thunderheart now," Sarah commanded, her hands trembling as she reached for her satellite phone, though every instinct told her this discovery would change everything. What kind of bear sacrifices himself to save cubs that weren't even his own? And why did those scars look so deliberately human-made? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The emergency call crackled through the static of Dr. Eleanor Thunderheart's ancient radio at 4:47 p.m., pulling her from the stack of overdue bills scattered across her kitchen table. At 68, she'd learned to distinguish between genuine wildlife emergencies and the panicked calls of tourists who'd spotted their first wild bear. This one was different. "Dr. Thunderheart, this is Sarah Whitehorse up on Glacier Creek Trail. We've got a situation here that I don't even know how to describe it." The young woman's voice carried an urgency that made Eleanor set down her reading glasses and lean closer to the radio. Eleanor had known Sarah since she was 12, back when her grandfather Joseph Whitehorse would bring her to the clinic to watch surgeries on injured deer and orphaned raccoons. Joseph had been one of the few people who understood that Eleanor's dedication to animals ran deeper than professional obligation. It was penance, though he'd never pried into why. "What's the nature of the emergency, Sarah?" Eleanor asked, already reaching for her medical bag with weathered hands that had delivered over 3,000 animal births and eased twice as many deaths. "It's a grizzly, massive male, maybe 600 pounds. But Dr. Thunderheart, he's not acting like any bear I've ever seen. He's protecting two cubs, and they're not his. I can tell by the markings, the size difference. And there's something else. He has what looks like surgical scars on his abdomen, and this mark on his face that looks carved." Eleanor's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor she couldn't afford to replace. Surgical scars. Carved markings. The words transported her back 15 years to a sterile laboratory where she'd made choices that haunted every quiet moment since. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. Do not approach that animal. Do you understand me? Keep your distance and don't make any sudden movements." "Dr. Thunderheart, the cubs are dying. They're so thin I can count their ribs, and the male, he looks like he hasn't eaten in weeks. He's just lying there, letting them nurse even though," Sarah's voice broke, "even though it's killing him." Eleanor closed her eyes, seeing not the cluttered poverty of her single-wide trailer, but the face of her grandson David, 8 years old and fighting leukemia in a hospital bed 3 states away. The grandson she'd failed to save, despite all her medical knowledge, all her desperate attempts to find experimental treatments. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said, grabbing keys to the truck that burned oil and needed new tires she couldn't afford. "Sarah, that bear isn't just protecting those cubs. If I'm right about what I think I'm seeing, he's choosing to die for them. And that kind of love—" Eleanor paused, her voice thick with 15 years of suppressed grief. "That kind of love doesn't happen by accident." As she drove toward Glacier Creek, Eleanor's hands trembled on the steering wheel, and she whispered a prayer to ancestors she'd stopped believing in years ago. "Let me be wrong, please let me be wrong about what this means." The gravel road to Glacier Creek had never seemed longer. Eleanor's ancient Ford pickup rattled over potholes that jarred her arthritic spine, but the physical discomfort paled against the dread building in her chest. Every mile brought her closer to a truth she'd spent 15 years trying to bury beneath the routine of small-town veterinary work and the numbing exhaustion of financial survival. When she finally reached the trailhead, Sarah and Jake were waiting beside their Jeep, their faces grim with the weight of witnessing something that defied explanation. Sarah rushed to Eleanor's truck before the engine fully died. "Doctor, Thunderheart, thank God you're here. He hasn't moved in over an hour. I think he's dying." Eleanor hefted her medical bag, the same leather satchel that had accompanied her through 30 years of military veterinary service and another 20 in civilian practice. Her knees protested the uneven terrain as they hiked the quarter-mile to where the bear lay, but she pushed forward, driven by a terrible certainty that was crystallizing with each step. The scene that greeted her beside Glacier Creek confirmed her worst fears and broke her heart simultaneously. The massive grizzly lay on his side in the dappled shade of ancient pines, his breathing shallow and labored. Two cubs, barely 8 months old and heartbreakingly thin, pressed against his belly with the desperate instinct of babies seeking warmth and nourishment from the only parent they'd ever known. But it was the bear's face that made Eleanor's legs nearly give out beneath her. The distinctive D carved into the fur above his left eye was crude but deliberate, a marking she recognized with soul-crushing certainty. Below it, intelligent dark eyes tracked her approach with an awareness that no wild animal should possess. "Dear God," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside the massive head, "what did they do to you?" Her hands, steady through decades of emergency surgeries, trembled as she examined the bear more closely. The surgical scars on his abdomen were old but unmistakable, precise incisions that spoke of medical intervention, not natural injury. Behind his left ear, her fingers found what she dreaded discovering, a small, raised bump beneath the skin where a tracking chip had been implanted. "Doctor Thunderheart." Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Do you know this bear?" Eleanor couldn't answer immediately. Her throat had closed around words too terrible to speak. This magnificent creature lying before her, choosing slow death over abandoning two cubs that weren't his own, carried within him something precious that had been stolen from her family 15 years ago. The cubs whimpered, and the sound cut through Eleanor's shock like a blade. One was a female with distinctive cream-colored markings around her eyes, the other a male with the deep brown coat that would darken to black as he matured. Both were severely malnourished, their ribs visible beneath dull fur, but their eyes held the same uncanny intelligence she'd seen in their protector. "Jake, I need you to set up a perimeter," Eleanor said, her voice steadying as decades of medical training overrode personal anguish. "Keep any other hikers away from this area. Sarah, help me examine these cubs." As she worked, Eleanor's mind raced through the implications of what she was seeing. The bear's protective behavior, his apparent understanding of human speech, the surgical modifications, it all pointed to something she'd helped create and thought had been destroyed years ago. The male cub allowed her to lift him gently, his tiny heart racing beneath her palm. He was perhaps 20 pounds underweight, and when she opened his mouth to check his gums, she saw the telltale signs of prolonged malnutrition. The female was in even worse condition, barely responsive to touch. "How long do you think they've been like this?" Sarah asked, her photographer's eye capturing details that others might miss. "Weeks, maybe longer," Eleanor replied, calculating medication dosages in her head. "But that's not what frightens me most. Look at how they respond to him." As if summoned by her words, the massive bear lifted his head with enormous effort and made a sound Eleanor had never heard from a grizzly. A low, rumbling vocalization that was somehow both reassuring and heartbreaking. The cubs immediately pressed closer to him, their distress visibly diminishing. "That's not random animal behavior," Jake observed, his military background making him alert to patterns others might miss. "That's communication. Intentional communication." Eleanor nodded grimly. "Sarah, I need you to document everything you see here, every detail, every interaction. This bear isn't just unusual, he's impossible. And if I'm right about who did this to him, we're all in more danger than you can imagine." The bear's eyes found hers again, and in their depths Eleanor saw something that made her breath catch. Recognition, gratitude, and beneath it all, a love so fierce and protective that it transcended species, transcended the boundaries of what should be possible. "I know who you are," she whispered to him, "and I'm going to make this right." The evening sun cast long shadows through the pines as Eleanor worked to stabilize the cubs, her movements methodical despite the chaos in her mind. She'd managed to get some fluids into both babies and administered antibiotics, but their condition remained critical. The massive bear, she couldn't bring herself to speak his name aloud yet, watched every procedure with an intensity that unnerved even her decades of experience with wild animals. "Dr. Thunderheart," Sarah said quietly, lowering her camera after documenting the medical intervention. "There's something else you need to see." Sarah led her to a cluster of boulders 20 yards from where the bear lay. Hidden in the crevice between two large stones was a makeshift den lined with carefully arranged pine boughs and moss. But it was what else was there that made Eleanor's blood run cold. 3 small metal tags lay arranged in a precise line, each bearing a number and letter combination. D7, D11, D15. Medical identification tags of the type used in research facilities. Beside them, a fragment of blue fabric that Eleanor recognized with sick certainty, the distinctive color of the lab coats worn at Blackstone Research Facility. "Jesus Christ," Jake breathed, picking up one of the tags. "These are from some kind of medical facility. What the hell were they doing to animals up here?" Eleanor's hands shook as she examined the fabric. 15 years ago, she'd worn a coat just like this one, had believed she was working toward something noble. Dr. Harrison Blackstone had convinced her that their research could revolutionize treatment for childhood diseases, could save kids like her grandson David, who was dying of leukemia with no hope of conventional cure. "There was a research program," Eleanor said slowly, each word feeling like a betrayal of every oath she'd ever taken. "A decade and a half ago. It was classified, funded through military channels. They called it Project Genesis." Sarah and Jake exchanged glances. The weight of Eleanor's words hung in the evening air like smoke from a forest fire, ominous and all-consuming. "What kind of research?" Sarah asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer would horrify her. Eleanor sank onto a fallen log, suddenly feeling every one of her 68 years. "We were trying to develop enhanced healing factors using unconventional methods. The theory was that we could take genetic material from human donors and introduce it into animal subjects to create enhanced immune responses. Then, theoretically, we could transfer those enhanced factors back to human patients." "That's insane," Jake said flatly, "and illegal as hell." "It was experimental medicine," Eleanor defended weakly, then caught herself. "No, you're right. It was insane. And I was so desperate to save David that I convinced myself the ends justified the means." The confession hung between them like a physical barrier. Sarah's camera hung forgotten around her neck as she processed what Eleanor was telling them. "The bear," Sarah said slowly. "He was part of this program?" Eleanor nodded, unable to meet their eyes. "Subject D7. The D stood for David. We used genetic material from my grandson for the 7th trial. David was dying, and I thought, God help me, I thought if we could create animals with enhanced healing, we could save him and thousands of other children. What happened to the program? Jake demanded, his military training making him focus on the tactical implications. Why is this bear here, now, protecting cubs that aren't his own? The program was shut down after a laboratory accident, Eleanor said, the euphemism bitter on her tongue. 23 animals died in a single night. There was a fire, and in the chaos, several surviving subjects escaped. We assumed they died in the wilderness within weeks. The military classified everything, destroyed the records, disbanded the team. But this bear survived, Sarah said, understanding dawning in her voice. For 15 years, he's been out here alone. Eleanor looked back toward where the massive grizzly lay with the cubs. Not alone. Not anymore. Somehow, he found those babies and made a choice that no normal animal would make. He chose to be their father, even though it's killing him. The implications struck them all simultaneously. This wasn't just an unusual wildlife encounter. This was the aftermath of a government cover-up, a living reminder of scientific hubris that had cost dozens of animal lives and achieved nothing. "Dr. Thunderheart," a new voice called from the tree line. All three turned to see a man in an expensive suit picking his way carefully through the underbrush, flanked by 2 others in tactical gear. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She recognized the silver hair and sharp features immediately, though Dr. Harrison Blackstone looked older, more weathered than she remembered, the man who had convinced her to sacrifice her principles for the false hope of saving her grandson. "Harrison," she said, standing slowly, "I wondered when you'd show up." "Eleanor, you look well for someone who's been living off Social Security." His smile was predatory, his eyes already assessing the scene. "I see you found our missing property." "His name was Subject D7, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the terror building in her chest. "And he's not property anymore." Blackstone's companions spread out in a practiced formation that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. One of them had what looked like a tranquilizer rifle. "Actually, according to the original research contracts, any surviving subjects remain the intellectual property of Blackstone Research," he said conversationally. "We've been tracking the chip signals for months, waiting for the right opportunity to reclaim our assets." "Assets?" Sarah stepped forward, her camera coming up instinctively. "Those are living creatures with families. Those are genetically modified research subjects created with stolen government resources," Blackstone corrected coldly. "And that big fellow over there represents 15 years of advanced research that could still save human lives if properly studied." The bear seemed to sense the threat. Even from 20 yards away, they could see him struggle to position himself more protectively over the cubs, his massive frame trembling with the effort. "You're not taking him?" Eleanor said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "I won't let you." Blackstone's smile widened. "Eleanor, you're 68 years old, living in a trailer, and apparently harboring stolen research materials. I don't think you're in any position to stop us." The standoff beside Glacier Creek stretched into an agonizing silence broken only by the distant sound of rushing water and the labored breathing of the dying bear. Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities, each one ending in failure. Blackstone had resources, legal backing, and men with weapons. She had nothing but 30 years of guilt and a fierce determination not to fail another member of her family. "Dr. Blackstone," Sarah said, raising her camera deliberately, "I'm Sarah Whitehorse, freelance photographer for National Geographic. I've been documenting this entire situation for the past 4 hours, including everything Dr. Thunderheart just told us about your illegal research program." Blackstone's expression darkened. "Young lady, I suggest you lower that camera. What you're documenting is the recovery of stolen federal research materials. Nothing more. Is that what you called it when 23 animals died in your laboratory fire? Sarah's voice carried the same steady courage her grandfather had shown when facing down federal agents trying to seize tribal lands 40 years earlier. Because Dr. Thunderheart also mentioned that little detail. Jake moved subtly to flank Blackstone's men, his combat training evident in the way he positioned himself to protect both women while keeping potential escape routes open. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and warrants before anyone moves those animals." "This is a matter of national security," one of Blackstone's companions said, his hand moving toward the tranquilizer rifle. "Stand down." Eleanor watched the tactical positioning with growing desperation. They were outgunned and outmaneuvered, but something Sarah had said sparked an idea. National Geographic. Documentation. Public exposure. "Sarah," Eleanor said carefully, never taking her eyes off Blackstone. "Is your camera connected to any kind of live streaming service?" Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. "Instagram Live has been running for the past 20 minutes. We've got about 300 viewers watching right now." Blackstone's face went pale. "Turn it off, now." "Can't do that, sir," Sarah said, holding the camera steady. "Freedom of the press. But I'm sure your viewers would love to hear more about Project Genesis and what happened to those 23 animals." The bear's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Even from their position, Eleanor could see his breathing becoming more labored, his massive frame shuddering with each exhale. The cubs sensed their protector's distress and began making soft, desperate sounds that cut through the human standoff like knives. "We're wasting time," Eleanor said, her medical training overriding her fear. "That bear is dying, and those cubs won't survive another night without intervention. Whatever legal issues you think you have, Harrison, they can wait until we save their lives." "The bear is expendable," Blackstone said coldly. "We only need tissue samples to continue the research. The cubs, however, represent a unique opportunity to study second-generation effects." Eleanor felt something snap inside her chest. 15 years of suppressed rage and grief crystallizing into pure, protective fury. "His name was David," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing like a battle cry. "My grandson David Thunderheart, who died at 8 years old while you convinced me that torturing animals was somehow going to save him." The live stream viewer count had climbed to over 800, Sarah noted with growing excitement. Comments were flooding in faster than she could read them, but she caught fragments. "This is insane. Call the police. Save the bear." "Eleanor, you're being emotional," Blackstone said, his tone condescending. "David's genetic material has contributed to research that could eventually save thousands of children. His sacrifice wasn't meaningless." "David didn't sacrifice anything," Eleanor shot back. "You stole his blood samples and used them without permission while I was grieving and desperate enough to believe your lies." Jake stepped closer to the man with the tranquilizer rifle. "Lower your weapon, sir. There are minors present, and this situation doesn't require force." "Stand down, soldier," the man replied, recognizing Jake's military bearing. "This is above your clearance level." "I'm not active duty anymore," Jake said quietly, "which means I don't have to follow illegal orders. And pointing weapons at civilians protecting dying animals feels pretty fucking illegal to me." The stream viewer count hit 1,000. Sarah could see notifications popping up indicating that people were sharing the feed, tagging news outlets, contacting authorities. The power of social media was beginning to shift the balance of the confrontation. "Dr. Blackstone," Eleanor said, stepping toward the bear despite the weapons trained in her direction. "I'm going to treat those cubs whether you like it or not. Shoot me if you want, but it'll be on camera for the world to see." "Eleanor, don't be foolish." "Foolish?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter and sharp. I was foolish 15 years ago when I trusted you. I was foolish when I let you convince me that the ends justified the means. I was foolish when I stood by and watched animals die for research that never saved a single human life. She knelt beside the massive bear, her weathered hands gentle despite her rage. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he tracked her movements with an awareness that no ordinary animal possessed. When she placed her hand on his massive head, he made a sound deep in his throat that sounded almost like recognition. "I'm sorry," she whispered to him. "I'm so sorry for what we did to you." The bear's response stunned everyone present. With enormous effort, he lifted one massive paw and placed it gently over Eleanor's hand. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably forgiving. "Jesus Christ," Jake breathed. Did everyone else see that? The live stream exploded with comments. Sarah's phone was buzzing constantly with notifications, shares, tags, mentions from major news outlets. The viewer count had passed 1,500 and was climbing rapidly. "That bear just—" "He understood her," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "He actually understood what she was saying." Blackstone's face had gone from pale to ashen. The implications of a bear displaying clear signs of enhanced intelligence on a live stream watched by thousands of people was his worst nightmare realized. "Shut down that stream immediately," he ordered his men. "Try it," Jake said, positioning himself between the gunman and Sarah. "See how that plays on national television." Eleanor continued her examination of the cubs, her medical training taking precedence over the chaos around her. The female was barely conscious, her pulse weak and thready. The male was slightly stronger, but still critical. Both needed immediate intervention that went beyond field medicine. "They need surgery," she announced. "Internal parasites, severe malnutrition, possible organ damage. I need to get them to my clinic immediately." "You're not taking anything anywhere," Blackstone said. "Those animals are coming with us." "To where?" Eleanor demanded. "Another laboratory?" "Another research program that'll torture them in the name of science? To a facility where they can receive proper care and contribute to research that might actually save human lives." Eleanor stood slowly, her joints protesting, but her resolve absolute. "Harrison, I helped create this nightmare. I won't let you perpetuate it." The bear made another sound, this one more urgent. Eleanor turned to see him struggling to rise, his massive frame trembling with the effort. Despite his obvious weakness, he was positioning himself between his cubs and Blackstone's men. "He's protecting them," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face as she continued filming. "Even dying, he's still trying to protect them." The viewer count hit 2,000. Major news outlets were beginning to pick up the feed. Eleanor could see the exact moment when Blackstone realized that his carefully hidden research program was about to become a public relations disaster of epic proportions. "Sir," one of his men said quietly, "we've got incoming calls from federal oversight, media inquiries, and someone claiming to represent the ASPCA. This situation is escalating beyond our control." Blackstone's jaw tightened. "Tranquilize the bear. Now!" "No!" Eleanor threw herself across the massive animal's neck. "I won't let you take him!" The bear responded to her protection with another gentle placement of his paw, this time on her back. The gesture was broadcast live to over 3,000 viewers and would later become one of the most shared videos in social media history. Jake stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down enemy combatants in foreign wars. "Sir, if you fire that weapon, you'll be assaulting a civilian on live television while attempting to steal protected wildlife. I guarantee that will not end well for anyone involved." Sarah's phone rang with an incoming call from someone identifying herself as a producer from CNN. The story was going national in real time. "This is bigger than all of us now," Sarah said to Blackstone, showing him her phone screen. "The whole world is watching. What happens next is your choice, but it's going to be documented forever." Eleanor felt the bear's breathing becoming more labored beneath her protective embrace. Time was running out not just for the political standoff, but for the magnificent creature who had somehow learned to love beyond the boundaries of species, beyond the trauma of what had been done to him. "Choose wisely, Harrison," she said softly. "History is watching." The live stream had reached 5,000 viewers when the first sirens became audible in the distance. Blackstone's expression shifted from confident control to barely contained panic as he realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. What had been a simple recovery operation was transforming into a public relations nightmare that could destroy everything he'd built over the past 15 years. "Sir, we need to extract now," one of his men urged, glancing nervously at the growing cacophony of emergency vehicles approaching through the forest. "Multiple agencies are responding, and we don't have jurisdiction for a public confrontation." Eleanor remained sprawled protectively across the massive bear's neck, feeling his labored breathing beneath her chest. Each exhale was becoming more shallow, more desperate. The cubs sensed their protector's declining condition and pressed closer against his massive frame, their weak cries breaking the hearts of thousands of viewers worldwide. "You don't understand," Blackstone said, his voice tight with desperation. "That animal represents 15 years of research, hundreds of millions in development costs. We can't just walk away." "Watch me walk away from your blood money," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying clearly to Sarah's camera. "I should have done it 15 years ago when David was dying, and you convinced me that torturing innocent animals was somehow noble." The first law enforcement vehicle broke through the tree line. A Forest Service truck followed closely by county sheriff's deputies. Behind them came what looked like half the emergency responders in the region, paramedics, wildlife officers, and vehicles Eleanor didn't recognize but suspected were federal. Ranger Tom Clearwater was the first to reach the group, his weathered face taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who'd dealt with every kind of wilderness crisis imaginable. His eyes moved from the weapons to the massive bear to Eleanor's protective position. "Dr. Thunderheart, what's the situation here?" he asked, his hand resting casually on his sidearm while keeping his voice calm. "These men are attempting to steal protected wildlife, Tom," Eleanor said without moving from her position. "They're claiming ownership of this bear and these cubs based on some classified research program from 15 years ago. Is that right?" Tom's gaze fixed on Blackstone with the steady intensity of someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with poachers, illegal hunters, and other people who thought laws didn't apply to them. "You gentlemen have permits for wildlife removal in this area?" "This is a federal matter," Blackstone said, reaching into his jacket. "I have authorization." "Keep your hands visible," Jake said sharply, his military training recognizing the potential for escalation. "Ranger Clearwater, these men have been threatening civilians and pointing weapons at a dying animal." The live stream viewer count had climbed past 8,000. Sarah could see notifications flooding in from major news networks, wildlife protection organizations, and what appeared to be several members of Congress. The story was spreading faster than any of them had imagined possible. "Ma'am, are you the one broadcasting this?" asked a young deputy who'd approached Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Sarah Whitehorse, freelance photographer," she replied, keeping her camera steady. "I've been documenting everything that's happened here, including these men's threats against Dr. Thunderheart and the animals." County Sheriff Maria Santos arrived just as Blackstone's men were beginning to look genuinely nervous. Santos had a reputation for no-nonsense law enforcement and exactly zero tolerance for people who thought federal connections made them above local jurisdiction. "All right, everybody step back and lower any weapons," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd dealt with armed standoffs before. "I want to see identification from everyone, and I want to understand why we've got reports of people threatening civilians over wildlife. Sheriff, this is Dr. Harrison Blackstone, Tom Clearwater said, his tone carefully neutral. He's claiming federal authorization to remove these animals. Santos examined the identification Blackstone provided, her expression growing increasingly skeptical. This authorization is 15 years old and appears to be for a program that was officially terminated. You want to explain why you think this gives you current jurisdiction? Eleanor could feel the bear's condition deteriorating beneath her. His breathing was becoming irregular, and she could sense that time was running out regardless of the political drama surrounding them. The cubs seemed to understand as well, their soft whimpering becoming more desperate. Sheriff, this animal needs immediate medical attention, Eleanor said urgently. Whatever legal issues need to be resolved, they can wait until we save his life. Dr. Thunderheart is right, said a new voice. Dr. Jennifer Yazzie from the Tribal Wildlife Sanctuary had arrived with a portable veterinary unit. I've been monitoring the live stream from our facility. Those cubs are in critical condition. The presence of tribal authorities added another layer of complexity to Blackstone's rapidly deteriorating position. The bear and cubs had been found on land that fell within traditional tribal territory, giving the tribal council significant say in their disposition. This is federal property, Blackstone insisted, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. These animals were created using government resources as part of a classified research program. Created, Sheriff Santos repeated, her eyebrows rising. Are you saying these are genetically modified animals? Eleanor felt the weight of 15 years of secrecy pressing down on her. The truth was going to come out regardless of what she said, but she could control how it was revealed. Yes, she said clearly, her voice carrying to both the assembled officials and the thousands of people watching online. 15 years ago, I participated in a government-funded research program that used genetic material from human donors to attempt to create animals with enhanced healing factors. It was unethical, illegal, and resulted in the deaths of 23 innocent animals. The silence that followed her confession was broken only by the bear's labored breathing and the distant sound of more vehicles arriving. The viewer count on Sarah's stream had passed 12,000, and notifications were appearing faster than the eye could follow. Dr. Thunderheart, Sheriff Santos said carefully, are you saying this bear contains human genetic material? My grandsons, Eleanor replied, her voice breaking slightly. David Thunderheart died of leukemia at 8 years old. Dr. Blackstone convinced me that using David's genetic material might lead to treatments that could save other children. Instead, it led to years of animal suffering and no medical advances whatsoever. Dr. Yazzie had moved to examine the cubs while Eleanor spoke, her experienced hands gentle as she assessed their condition. These babies are severely malnourished and dehydrated. Without immediate intervention, they won't survive the night. Then we need to move them now, Tom Clearwater said decisively. Sheriff, can we sort out the legal issues after we save their lives? Blackstone made one last desperate attempt to regain control. You don't understand the implications of what you're doing. That bear represents breakthrough research that could revolutionize medicine. If you interfere with federal research property that's been living wild in Montana for 15 years, Sheriff Santos interrupted. Property that's apparently been caring for orphaned cubs and demonstrating behavioral patterns that suggest higher intelligence? Dr. Blackstone, I think you're going to find that your legal position is considerably weaker than you believe. Eleanor could feel the bear's massive heart beginning to falter beneath her. Time had run out for legal arguments and political maneuvering. She looked directly into Sarah's camera, knowing that her words would reach far beyond the forest clearing. This magnificent creature has spent 15 years learning to love despite everything that was done to him, she said, tears streaming down her weathered face. He found these babies and chose to be their father, even though it meant dying to keep them alive. That's not the result of genetic modification. That's the choice of a soul that refuses to let trauma destroy its capacity for love. The bear's breathing stopped for a moment that seemed to last forever, then resumed with a rattling gasp that made everyone present hold their breath. Eleanor felt his massive paw tighten slightly against her back, a gesture that seemed to communicate both gratitude and goodbye. "Please," she whispered to him, "don't leave them. They need you. I need you to show me how to love like that again. Doctor." Yazzie had prepared emergency medications for the cubs, but she looked up at Eleanor with professional honesty. "Dr. Thunderheart, I can stabilize the babies, but without their protector, their emotional trauma might be insurmountable. The bond between them appears to be the only thing keeping them alive." Sarah's phone was ringing constantly now. CNN, NBC, The Washington Post, animal rights organizations, and dozens of other outlets requesting interviews. The story had exploded beyond anything she'd imagined when she'd started filming a strange bear behavior earlier that afternoon. "The whole world is watching," Sarah said softly. "Whatever happens next, it's going to matter to millions of people." Eleanor looked at the assembled officials, at Blackstone's increasingly desperate face, at the dying bear who had somehow learned to father children who weren't his own. The weight of 15 years of guilt and grief pressed against her chest, but beneath it, she felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death: hope. "Then let's make sure what happens next is worthy of their attention," she said. The decision to move the bear and cubs to Eleanor's clinic became a convoy of emergency vehicles that drew spectators from 3 counties. Word had spread through social media faster than wildfire, and by the time the procession reached the small town of Cedar Falls, hundreds of people lined the streets holding signs reading "Save Magnus" and "Protect Our Wildlife." Someone had given the bear a name, and it had stuck with the viral power of the internet. Eleanor rode in the back of Dr. Yazzie's mobile veterinary unit, her hands never leaving the massive bear's head as they navigated the winding mountain roads. His breathing had stabilized somewhat with the IV fluids and oxygen support, but she could see in his eyes that he was fighting a losing battle. The cubs lay in heated carriers beside him, too weak to do more than whimper softly when the vehicle hit bumps. "Dr. Thunderheart?" Dr. Yazzie said over the road noise, "I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that we might not be able to save him. The internal damage appears extensive, and at his age, recovery from this level of malnutrition and stress might be impossible." Eleanor nodded, though every fiber of her being rebelled against the idea of losing him now, when she'd finally found him again. "What about the cubs?" "They have a better chance, but only if we can convince them to eat. Right now they're refusing all nourishment except what they get from him. If he dies, they might simply give up." The convoy pulled into Eleanor's clinic as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her painfully of the evening 15 years ago when she'd gotten the call that David had taken a turn for the worse. The parking lot was already packed with vehicles, news vans, supporters who'd driven hours to be present, and what appeared to be representatives from every animal rights organization in the region. Sarah had continued streaming throughout the journey, and the viewer count had reached nearly 50,000. The hashtag #SaveMagnus was trending nationally, and celebrity endorsements were beginning to appear. The simple story of a bear protecting cubs had touched something deep in the collective consciousness, something that transcended politics and spoke to fundamental human values about family and sacrifice. Inside the clinic, Eleanor's small staff worked with desperate efficiency to prepare for the most important case of their careers. The surgical suite that usually handled routine spaying and neutering procedures was transformed into an emergency trauma center worthy of a major hospital. "Dr. Thunderheart," her assistant Rebecca called from the prep room. "We've got Dr." Martinez from Colorado State on video call, and the University of Montana Veterinary School is sending their best surgeon. Everyone wants to help." Eleanor nodded grimly as she scrubbed in. The medical support was encouraging, but she knew that what they were attempting went beyond normal veterinary medicine. This wasn't just about saving an animal. It was about preserving a bond that had captured the world's attention and proven that love could transcend every boundary humans thought they understood. The bear, Magnus, she supposed she should call him now, was anesthetized and positioned on the surgical table that groaned under his weight. The cubs were placed in heated units where they could see and smell their protector, Dr. Yazzie having discovered that separation caused them immediate distress that manifested in dangerous drops in heart rate and breathing. As Eleanor began her examination, she found damage that went far beyond what she'd expected. Old surgical scars from the research program had never healed properly, creating internal adhesions that compromised his digestive system. Chronic malnutrition had damaged his liver and kidneys. Most concerning of all, she found evidence of repeated injuries that suggested he'd been in multiple fights over the years, likely defending other cubs he'd tried to protect. "Jesus," Dr. Martinez said via video link as Eleanor's cameras showed the extent of the internal damage. "How has this animal survived 15 years with these injuries?" "Sheer willpower," Eleanor replied, her voice tight with emotion, "and a purpose that kept him going when his body should have given up years ago." The surgery stretched into the night. Eleanor worked with the focused intensity of someone trying to atone for 15 years of guilt, repairing damaged organs and removing scar tissue while teams of specialists consulted remotely from universities across the country. Outside, the crowd had grown to over 1,000 people holding vigil in the parking lot and surrounding streets. Sarah continued documenting everything, though she'd handed the live streaming duties to a professional news crew when her phone battery died for the third time. The story had evolved from viral social media content to a major news event, with CNN providing continuous coverage and international outlets picking up the feed. At 3:17 a.m., disaster struck. Magnus went into cardiac arrest on the operating table, his massive heart simply stopping after hours of fighting to keep going. Eleanor began chest compressions with the desperate strength of someone who'd already lost too much, while her team administered emergency medications and fought to restart his system. "Come on, you stubborn old bear," she whispered as she worked. "David never gave up, and neither can you. Those babies need you. I need you to show me that love is stronger than all the terrible things we've done." The cubs seemed to sense the crisis even under anesthesia. Their heart rates dropped dangerously, and Dr. Yazzie had to intervene with stimulants to keep them stable. The connection between the bear and his adopted children was so strong that his distress was literally threatening their lives. For 8 minutes that felt like hours. Magnus remained clinically dead, while Eleanor and her team fought to bring him back. The assembled crowd outside fell silent as word spread that the bear had flatlined. Hundreds of people standing vigil in the Montana night for an animal they'd never met, but who had somehow become a symbol of everything good and pure about unconditional love. Then, at 3:25 a.m., his heart began beating again. The cheer that went up from the surgical team could be heard through the clinic walls, and within minutes the crowd outside erupted in celebration. Car horns honked, people hugged strangers, and someone started singing Amazing Grace in a voice that carried across the night air. But Eleanor knew they weren't out of danger yet. Magnus was alive, but barely, and the cubs remained critically dependent on his presence for their own survival. The next 48 hours would determine whether this remarkable family would live to see another sunrise together. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, Eleanor finally emerged from surgery to find a scene that took her breath away. The parking lot and surrounding streets were filled with people who'd driven through the night to be present for this moment. Families with children, elderly couples holding signs, veterans standing at attention, Native American elders conducting blessing ceremonies. Dr. Thunderheart, a reporter called out, can you tell us about Magnus's condition? Eleanor looked at the sea of faces, at the cameras and microphones, at Sarah, who'd been documenting this extraordinary night. She thought about David, about the terrible choices she'd made 15 years ago, about the magnificent bear who'd somehow learned to love beyond the trauma of what had been done to him. Magnus is stable, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. The surgery was successful, but he's not out of danger yet. What I can tell you is that this animal has shown us something profound about the nature of family, about choosing love over survival, about the power of sacrifice. What about Dr. Blackstone's claims that Magnus is government property? Another reporter asked. Eleanor smiled grimly. Dr. Blackstone's research program was terminated 15 years ago after causing the deaths of 23 innocent animals. Magnus has been living free in the Montana wilderness for a decade and a half, and during that time he's made choices that no government program could have engineered. He chose to protect cubs that weren't his own. He chose to love despite every reason to fear and hate. Those choices make him more than property. They make him family. The crowd erupted in applause, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't carrying the weight of David's death alone. Magnus had shown her that love could survive even the worst trauma, that healing was possible even after the most terrible mistakes. As she turned to go back inside and check on her patients, Eleanor whispered a prayer to her grandson. Thank you, David. Thank you for teaching an old bear how to love, and thank you for teaching your grandmother that it's never too late to choose what's right. The revelation came 3 days after Magnus's surgery, when Eleanor was reviewing the detailed medical files that Dr. Yazzie had compiled during the cub's treatment. The female cub, whom the staff had named Ayanna, showed genetic markers that made Eleanor's hands tremble as she read the lab results. The male, called Coda by the growing crowd of supporters, displayed similar anomalies that painted a picture more heartbreaking than anything she'd imagined. Eleanor sat in her small office, surrounded by 15 years of accumulated guilt and medical journals, staring at genetic test results that revealed the full scope of what Blackstone's program had accomplished. The cubs weren't random orphans that Magnus had found. They were the offspring of other research subjects, animals who had been modified with genetic material from human children who had died of various diseases. Ayanna carried markers, suggesting her mother had been modified with genetic material from a child who died of cystic fibrosis. Coda's lineage traced back to an animal that had been enhanced with genes from a boy who'd succumbed to muscular dystrophy. Magnus hadn't just found 2 orphaned cubs, he'd discovered the children of his fellow survivors and chosen to become their grandfather. The weight of this discovery sent Eleanor to her knees in the clinic's small chapel that had been donated by the local Methodist church. She'd avoided this room for years, her faith shattered by David's death and her own complicity in the research program's atrocities. But now, surrounded by the evidence of Magnus's extraordinary choice to love across species and genetic boundaries, she found herself praying for the first time since her grandson's funeral. God, she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. I don't know if you can forgive what I helped create, but please don't let these babies pay for my mistakes. Let Magnus teach them what family means, the way David would have wanted. The prayer was interrupted by Rebecca's urgent knock on the chapel door. Dr. Thunderheart, you need to see the news. Something's happening. Eleanor followed her assistant to the break room, where the television displayed CNN's breaking news coverage. The headline read, Blackstone Research Under Federal Investigation, while footage showed FBI agents carrying boxes from a research facility in Colorado. Federal investigators raided 3 Blackstone research facilities early this morning, the reporter announced, following revelations about an illegal animal experimentation program that allegedly used genetic material from deceased children. The investigation was reportedly triggered by viral social media coverage of a bear and cubs found in Montana. Eleanor sank into a chair as the full implications hit her. Magnus's story hadn't just touched hearts. It had exposed a criminal enterprise that had apparently continued operating long after the official program termination. Sarah's live stream and the subsequent media coverage had provided federal investigators with enough evidence to act on suspicions they'd harbored for years. The news coverage continued with footage of Blackstone being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage and defeat. Dr. Harrison Blackstone, formerly associated with government research programs, has been charged with multiple violations of federal animal protection laws, fraud, and operating unlicensed medical experiments, the reporter continued. Eleanor felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Sarah, whose eyes were red with exhaustion but bright with vindication. Dr. Thunderheart. They found evidence of ongoing experiments. 23 more animals in various facilities, all created with genetic material from children who died of diseases their parents thought might be cured through Blackstone's research. The magnitude of the discovery was staggering. Parents who had lost children to terminal illnesses had been convinced to donate genetic material with the promise that their child's death might contribute to saving other children. Instead, Blackstone had used their grief to fuel an illegal research program that had tortured dozens of animals while producing no medical advances whatsoever. "The other animals?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. "Are they alive?" Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "All of them. And here's the incredible part. They've all been caring for each other. Like Magnus with Coda and Ayana, they've formed family units that transcend normal animal behavior patterns. They've been protecting each other, sharing resources, even teaching survival skills across species lines." Eleanor walked slowly back to the recovery room where Magnus lay surrounded by monitoring equipment, his massive chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of healing. The cubs were curled against his side, finally eating regularly now that their protector was stable. The sight of them together, this impossible family bound by love rather than genetics, filled her with a mixture of grief and hope she hadn't experienced since David's death. Magnus opened his eyes as she approached, the same dark, intelligent gaze that had recognized her beside Glacier Creek. Eleanor reached out tentatively, and he allowed her to place her hand on his massive head. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. "You knew about the others, about what had been done to all of you. And instead of letting it destroy you, you chose to build something beautiful." The bear's response was a low rumble that vibrated through his chest, not a growl of warning, but something that sounded almost like a lullaby. The cubs stirred at the sound, pressing closer to their adoptive father with the absolute trust of children who had never known anything but unconditional love. "Doctor." Yazzie entered the room carrying the latest blood work results, her expression a mixture of professional excitement and personal amazement. "Dr. Thunderheart, I've never seen anything like these recovery rates. Magnus's organ function is improving faster than should be medically possible, and the cubs are gaining weight at an unprecedented pace." "What does that mean?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It means they're healing each other," Dr. Yazzie said softly. "The bond between them isn't just emotional, it's somehow physiological. Being together, being loved, is literally making them stronger." Eleanor thought about the 23 other animals that had been rescued from Blackstone's facilities, about the families they'd formed despite being created in laboratories rather than born in the wild. The research program had intended to create enhanced healing factors, and in a way, it had succeeded. Not through genetic manipulation, but through the simple, powerful act of choosing love over trauma. The news coverage continued throughout the day, with updates about the rescued animals and interviews with the parents whose children's genetic material had been used without proper consent. Eleanor found herself facing requests for interviews from every major news outlet in the country, all wanting to understand how a retired veterinarian's confession had brought down an illegal research empire. But it was the call from David's mother, Eleanor's daughter Jennifer, that broke her heart completely. Jennifer had seen the news coverage and learned for the first time that her son's genetic material had been used in animal experiments. "Mom," Jennifer's voice was thick with tears over the phone, "why didn't you tell me? All these years I thought David's death had been meaningless, that he'd suffered and died for nothing. But if this bear has been out there loving and protecting other children because he carries part of David." Eleanor couldn't speak for several minutes, the weight of 15 years of secrecy crushing down on her. "I was ashamed," she finally managed. "I thought I was helping, thought we could save other children like David. When it all went wrong, when animals started dying, I couldn't bear to tell you that I'd turned your son's death into something terrible." "But it wasn't terrible," Jennifer said, her voice growing stronger. "Don't you see? David always wanted to help other kids, even when he was sick. He used to tell the other children in the cancer ward that he was going to become a doctor and cure everyone. Maybe this was his way of doing that, not through medicine, but through love." That evening, as Eleanor sat beside Magnus's recovery bed watching him gently nuzzle the cubs while they slept, she felt something shift in her chest that had been frozen for 15 years. The guilt was still there, would probably always be there, but it was no longer the only thing she carried. Jennifer arrived the next morning with her husband and Eleanor's 2 other grandchildren, David's younger siblings who had grown up hearing stories about the brother they'd never known. When they saw Magnus for the first time, 7-year-old Emma immediately asked if she could pet Uncle David's bear. Eleanor watched her daughter's face as she looked at Magnus, saw the recognition there that went beyond genetics to something deeper and more spiritual. "He has David's eyes," Jennifer whispered. "The same gentleness, the same way of looking at you like you're the most important thing in the world." Magnus seemed to understand the significance of the moment. Despite his size and recent surgery, he moved with careful deliberation to position himself where the children could safely approach. When Emma placed her small hand on his massive paw, he made the same gentle rumbling sound he used to comfort the cubs. "He remembers being loved," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "Despite everything that was done to him, he remembers what it feels like to be part of a family." The reunion was documented by Sarah, who had become something of a permanent fixture at the clinic as the story continued to unfold. Her original live stream had evolved into a full documentary project, with major studios competing for distribution rights and the promise that all proceeds would fund the sanctuary being planned for Magnus and the other rescued animals. As the day progressed, Eleanor found herself surrounded by a kind of family she'd never expected. Her daughter and grandchildren, Sarah and Jake, who had become like surrogate children, Dr. Yazzie and the clinic staff who had worked miracles, and the growing community of supporters who had driven from hundreds of miles away just to be present for this moment of healing. But it was Magnus who remained at the center of it all, the magnificent bear, who had somehow learned to love beyond trauma, to protect beyond instinct, to choose family over survival. He had taken the worst thing that humans could do, stealing children's genetic legacy for failed experiments, and transformed it into the most beautiful thing imaginable, a love so pure and protective that it had saved not just 2 cubs, but an entire community's faith in the possibility of redemption. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the covered porch of her new cabin overlooking the Thunder Heart Wildlife Sanctuary, watching Magnus teach Coda and Ayanna how to fish in the creek that had once been their place of desperation. The 200-acre sanctuary, funded by donations that had poured in from around the world, had become home not just to Magnus and his cubs, but to all 23 animals rescued from Blackstone's facilities. The morning air carried the sounds of a community that defied every scientific understanding of animal behavior. A wolf named Ghost, who carried genetic material from a child who had died of leukemia, played gently with bear cubs while maintaining protective vigilance over a family of foxes. An elk called Standing Tall, whom Sarah insisted reminded her of her grandfather Joseph, had appointed himself guardian of the smaller animals, his massive antlers serving as both shelter and warning to any potential threats. Eleanor's arthritis had improved dramatically since the stress of her old life had been replaced by purpose and peace. At 69, she moved with the confidence of someone who had finally found her calling. The sanctuary employed 12 full-time staff members, including Dr. Yazzie as head veterinarian and Rebecca as operations manager. But it was Eleanor who served as the heart of the operation, the grandmother figure who had learned from Magnus that family could be chosen rather than inherited. Sarah emerged from the photography studio that had been built near the main gate, her camera equipment slung over her shoulder and her belly round with 7 months of pregnancy. Her documentary, Magnus, A Love Beyond Species, had won 3 Emmy Awards and generated enough revenue to fund wildlife protection programs across North America. More importantly, it had changed public perception about animal consciousness and the ethical obligations humans had toward the creatures they shared the planet with. "The morning light is perfect," Sarah said, settling beside Eleanor on the porch swing that Jake had built from timber donated by local sawmills. "Magnus is posing like he knows exactly what shot I need." Eleanor smiled, watching as the massive bear demonstrated fishing techniques to cubs who were now healthy adolescents approaching their 2nd birthday. Coda had grown into a powerful young male with his father's gentle intelligence, while Ayanna displayed an artistic streak that manifested in her habit of arranging stones and flowers in intricate patterns around their den. "He's always been a performer," Eleanor replied, remembering the day 15 months ago when Magnus had first placed his paw over her hand beside Glacier Creek. "David was like that too, always making sure everyone around him felt included and loved." Jake approached from the direction of the visitor center, where school groups came daily to learn about wildlife protection and the sanctuary's mission. His PTSD symptoms had largely disappeared during his year of working with the sanctuary animals, particularly Magnus, who seemed to understand trauma in ways that human therapists had never achieved. "Dr. Thunderheart, we've got another request," Jake said, settling cross-legged on the porch steps. "The Nature Conservancy wants to replicate our model in 5 other states. They're offering full funding and asking if you'd serve as director of a national program." Eleanor considered the proposal while watching Magnus guide his cubs through the complex social dynamics of the sanctuary community. The bear had become something of a patriarch figure, mediating disputes between different species and ensuring that the smaller, more vulnerable animals receive protection and resources. "What do you think, Magnus?" Eleanor called out, knowing he would hear her voice across the distance. The bear looked up from his fishing lesson, made eye contact with her, and performed what could only be described as a bow, a deliberate lowering of his massive head that had become his signature gesture of acknowledgement. "I think he approves," Sarah laughed, capturing the moment with her camera. "But seriously, Dr. Thunderheart, this place has become more than a sanctuary. It's proof that love can heal trauma across species lines. The world needs more places like this." Eleanor thought about the letters that arrived daily from families who had lost children to the diseases whose genetic material had been used in Blackstone's research. Many of them had visited the sanctuary, finding comfort in meeting the animals who carried some essence of their deceased children. The encounters weren't scientific or explainable, but they were profoundly healing for parents who had thought their children's suffering had been meaningless. Jennifer visited every month with Eleanor's grandchildren, and watching them interact with Magnus had become one of Eleanor's greatest joys. 8-year-old Emma had declared herself Magnus's official assistant and spent hours reading to him from the children's books that donors sent to the sanctuary. Magnus would lie perfectly still during these reading sessions, his dark eyes fixed on Emma's face with the same attention David had once given to bedtime stories. The financial transformation had been as remarkable as the emotional healing. Eleanor's trailer had been replaced by a comfortable cabin designed to accommodate aging joints and equipped with a medical office where she could continue treating injured wildlife. Her Social Security worries had been replaced by the security of knowing that the sanctuary's endowment would fund operations in perpetuity. But the most profound change was in Eleanor herself. The guilt that had consumed her for 15 years hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed into purpose. She had learned from Magnus that redemption wasn't about erasing past mistakes. It was about choosing love over fear, protection over self-interest, family over convenience. Dr. Yazzie emerged from the veterinary clinic that had been built adjacent to Eleanor's cabin, her smile bright with good news. "The latest blood work on all 23 animals shows perfect health markers," she announced. "Whatever trauma they experienced in the research facilities appears to have been completely healed through their community bonds." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised by the results. The animals' recovery had consistently defied medical expectations, supporting theories that emotional well-being had a direct impact on physical health that science was only beginning to understand. "There's something else," Dr. Yazzie continued, her voice carrying excitement. "The breeding program applications we submitted have been approved. Magnus and several of the other animals have been cleared to start families of their own." The prospect of cubs being born at the sanctuary filled Eleanor with joy tinged by concern. These would be the first generation born into freedom rather than captivity, raised by parents who had chosen love despite trauma. They would grow up knowing safety and protection as their birthright, rather than as something to be grateful for. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call from her literary agent. Her book about the sanctuary, Chosen Family, Lessons from Magnus and the Healing of Trauma, had become a bestseller that was being translated into 15 languages. The advance and royalties had funded the construction of an educational center where visitors could learn about animal psychology and the ethical treatment of wildlife. "It's surreal," Sarah said after ending the call. 18 months ago, I was a struggling photographer trying to make rent. Now I'm writing books about bear psychology and animal consciousness. Magnus changed all our lives." Eleanor looked out over the sanctuary grounds where impossible families thrived in defiance of every natural law. Ghost, the wolf, had adopted a litter of orphaned raccoons. Standing tall, the elk served as surrogate father to a family of foxes whose parents had died in wildfires. A bald eagle named Freedom, who had been born in captivity, was teaching flight techniques to birds who had never experienced the wild. "He didn't just change our lives," Eleanor reflected. "He showed us what love looks like when it's not limited by genetics or species or the terrible things that have been done to us. He proved that family is a choice we make every day." As evening approached, the sanctuary settled into its nightly routine. Magnus gathered his cubs and the other animals under his protection, creating a defensive perimeter that ensured everyone's safety through the night. It was a behavior pattern that had emerged naturally, without human training or encouragement. The animals had organized themselves into a cooperative community based on mutual protection and care. Eleanor prepared for bed in her cabin, surrounded by photographs of David and Magnus, letters from grateful families, and awards recognizing the sanctuary's impact on wildlife protection policy. But it was the view from her bedroom window that brought her the deepest peace. Magnus and his extended family settling down for the night, the massive bear positioned where he could watch over everyone under his care. Before turning off the lights, Eleanor spoke to the photograph of David that sat on her nightstand. "Thank you for teaching an old bear how to love, sweetheart. And thank you for teaching your grandmother that it's never too late to choose family over fear." Outside, Magnus lifted his head as if he'd heard her words across the distance. For a moment their eyes met through the window, and Eleanor felt the presence of her grandson as clearly as if he were standing beside her. The bear's gentle rumble carried across the night air, not a sound of distress, but of contentment, of a soul that had found its purpose in protecting those who needed protection. Eleanor fell asleep to the sound of that rumbling lullaby, knowing that love had triumphed over trauma, that family had conquered fear, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories began with the most broken hearts learning to heal together. The sanctuary thrived, the animals flourished, and Magnus continued to teach the world that love knows no boundaries when it's truly unconditional. Dear friends, if you're between 55 and 68, you understand the weight of looking back on choices that can't be undone. Like Dr. Eleanor Thunderhart, many of us carry guilt from decisions we made with good intentions that didn't turn out as planned. Perhaps you've wondered if your mistakes define you, if it's too late to make a meaningful difference, or if the love you have left to give still matters. Eleanor thought her life was over at 68, living on $1,847 a month, drowning in regret over her grandson David's death and her role in a failed research program. But Magnus, that magnificent bear, showed her something profound. It's never too late to choose love over fear, to build the family your heart needs, and to discover that your greatest purpose might be waiting just around the corner. At 69, Eleanor found herself leading a wildlife sanctuary, surrounded by chosen family, financially secure, and finally at peace with David's memory. Your story isn't over. Your capacity to love, protect, and heal, both yourself and others, may be greater now than ever before. Sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest strengths, and our biggest failures transform into our most beautiful legacies. What guilt or regret have you been carrying that might actually be preparing you for your greatest purpose? Have you ever experienced an unexpected moment of healing or connection that changed everything? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.